All right, Drukhari players, let's do this. It's Tom, the very lowest of men, here, back with Return of the Archon, and we are talking about Drukhari after the Dataslate. Obviously, I've had a little bit of time to ruminate on this now. I've had a lot of time to chat with some very smart Archons around the UK and get their perspectives. So I'm going to offer a few hot takes here on the points changes and on some of the different directions you can take things for Drukhari now. And I guess the headline news is this is not as bad as I think it can feel like it was. I think Drukhari have definitely taken a points nerf here, and they were obviously one of the stronger performing factions in the game in terms of event wins, win rate, etc., etc. I know some of the playing community don't necessarily agree with that, but that was what the data was showing. So I think you have to adjust the game on that basis. And I think Drukhari come out of this perhaps needing to retool a little bit, perhaps needing to respec, but definitely still in the position where you can build good Drukhari lists to compete in the current meta and win games. So let's talk about how and why that is. Okay, so if you have a look through the points changes here, you can see that there are some points rises. The Archon goes up 10, the Beastmaster goes up 15, Court of the Archon goes up 10, Drazar goes up 10, perhaps to keep parity with the Archon. The Incubi go up 10 per 5 as well, which is quite painful for the Incubi. Lilith goes up 10, perhaps the only fully deserved one here. Lilith, obviously amazing. Mandrakes go up 5, Reavers go up 5 as well. And we are handed a little boost in the form of Hellions going down to 75 points. Now, this is something that I laughed at and took the piss out of a little bit when I first saw it, but actually I think the overall discussion amongst Archons right now is that there are some opportunities with the Hellions. So we'll get to that in just a moment. If we're going to summarize these changes, I think the key thing is to say that most Sky Splinter lists, any list building into transports, multiple Archons, Incubi, etc., they are taking the single worst hit. That's obviously been the most common archetype for Drukhari in recent times, and that's the one that's definitely going to be losing a unit minimum, potentially two, depending on how you built it. And I think that's quite painful for Sky Splinter. But there are some opportunities here, and that's worth commenting on. I think if we think about the slight reorganizing and respecking, there are a lot of things in here which are not hit at all. So Grotesques, Talos, Urian Rakarth, these all work really well in the Realspace Raiders detachment. And one of the plugs I would say is that Realspace Raiders is well worth another look at this moment in time. Those all stay cheap. Scourge stay cheap. So if you're building around Scourge or if you're taking a Void Raven Bomber, again, no points rises that you have to deal with here either. And the transports also stay cheap too. Likewise, racks. So I think this nudges things in a few different directions. You are not likely to want to spam Archons in the same way now that they cost what they do. You know, an Archon as a Warlord with a Court or an Archon with an Incubi squad has definitely gone up. And you need that for the sort of hammer blow potential that it has, but you can't necessarily go wide with this and try and look to push multiple big kills in melee with multiple Archons with Incubi squads in quite the same way. So I think building away from Sky Splinter into Realspace Raiders is one way of really avoiding having to deal with this, because one of the great things about Realspace Raid, and shout out to Scary who's won a GT, shout out to Dan Whitaker who's placed extremely high just at this weekend gone at Coventry GT and beat a lot of big names on his way to a 7-1 with Realspace Raiders. The advantage this detachment has is it doesn't rely on transports in the same way. You don't need to be building in all of those Incubi Venom combos in Realspace Raiders, because actually you can lean a little bit more into the shooting for one, and you can build into the Talos and the Haywire, giving you very nice, reliable anti-tank shooting. And mech skew has become quite popular in the meta, and I think is likely to become more so as well. So Talos Haywire is really nice as an anchor for popping tanks, transports, and Talos themselves are great at hoovering up small infantry squads or medium-sized marine squads. So again, they're versatile. They can deal with a lot of different things in the game. And I fully expect to see Drukhari players looking to exploit Talos more in their builds. Maybe not quite as much on UKTC, but it is worth saying Dan has made that list sing. So a strong list with Grotesque and Talos is very, very important. Now, the other thing to say is that I think in the search for juice and output, Mandrakes perhaps might be one of the casualties here, right? Mandrakes already don't get into as many parts of the board using their teleporting as they used to. The opponent is usually very good at keeping them out the back. On a lot of deployments in Pariah Nexus and with a lot of the scoring cards, I have found in games my Mandrakes tend to end up quite central or just on the flanks. And you can make a very real case to say that Drukhari lists, which either build around the battle line infantry split across transports, some of them walking on, some of them in transports, or, and this is where the new options come in, building around, for example, Hellions, who are essentially only 5 points more but can actually fight into sort of medium targets, boast a little bit of shooting, and have plenty of speed in their own right to get around. You can use Hellions in a more flexible role where they could do early skirmishing and trading, but they also give you the option of a speedy unit which can get somewhere and score cards as you need as well. So I think that's one area you might want to look at as well. Is it worth sort of segueing a couple of Hellion squads in? Is it time perhaps to trim back on the Mandrakes? I think Hellions like Lilith Squad also benefit from advance and charge in the Realspace Raiders attachments. That's another reason to potentially look at that. And I think one of the reasons, another reason in general that I'm more up on Realspace Raiders in the wake of these changes is that it has a better pain token economy across a wider range of units. You just have more pain tokens. I'm looking at racks and have been playing with racks in a very similar fashion. I think popping a couple of rack squads into a Realspace Raiders list, or indeed a Sky list now, where you're going to have to work that a little bit harder to get your kills and going to have to work that a little bit harder to make sure you have enough tokens in the game. I think that's all extremely relevant. And I think that in that sense, Drukhari are quite well suited for what's to come. A lot of the top armies in the game are ones Drukhari have some solid game into, I think. Bulgrin going away, but guards staying prevalent is actually quite good for Drukhari. Aquilons being quite common, Drukhari have plenty of little tools for hurting guard screens and killing the tanks. So I think that's a net positive overall. Sisters getting weaker definitely helps Drukhari because that was one of our awful matchups. But I think -1 to wound Talos are much better at absorbing Sisters shooting than, again, our transports were, right? So I think the points changes for me lean into this move back towards Realspace Raiders that I've seen a couple of the best players doing. And I think that's probably where I'd be tempted to start if I was looking to take Drukhari to an event right now. But it's worth saying that, your packages like the Beastmaster, like the Court of the Archon, or like the Incubi, these don't go away. I think it's just that you have to build your list a little bit more carefully around these. You're not going to have quite as many hammers in the list if you want to have the sort of width of assets that we have. But I think building into flexible scoring units that can also be dangerous, and again, that's where Hellions are particularly interesting, I think that helps to shore it up. I think it's well worth looking at Grotesque and Talos as an anchor. It's well worth looking at Urian Rakarth if you haven't explored him, because he stays very good value. To have someone who can get back up when they dies gives you a nice little skirmishing and trading piece in an environment where you're perhaps going down one trade piece from what you previously had. So I think for Drukhari, it's a case of retooling, adapting a little bit. If one of the advantages of building towards Realspace Raiders having more pain tokens for the shooting and just being able to do more of your damage in shooting and using your melee for cleanup. I think Sky Splinter always was a little bit vulnerable on the shooting side, unless going really heavy into Void Raven bombers or something like that. It actually didn't have the same raw amount of shooting output, and its pain tokens couldn't be spent in that way. I think that's probably the initial sort of set of directions that I'm thinking here. I'll be very curious to see whether Sky Splinter continues to succeed. It obviously still does have an enormous amount of damage, but what it's going to feel, I think, is just that loss of one or two assets in particular games. I think some of the new meta arrivals in terms of Blood Angels, for example, and Melee GSC create interesting new challenges for Drukhari, but obviously as a counter melee army, I think they still have plenty of potential into these things as well. So yeah, I think I'm really interested to see what people do with Drukhari. Are you going to try Realspace Raiders as I've been trying? Are you going to go and retool for that? Or is there a Sky Splinters build that you think is still really potent and powerful that you'd like to shout about? In which case, let us know in the comments. I would really like to hear it. And hopefully I'll be able to get some content soon with some aspiring Archons who've been out and about hunting and taking skulls. And we can get their experiences of playing Drukhari in the post-Dataslate meta. That's it for me for this time, and I'll see you again very soon. Lowest of Men, out. Bye-bye.